They laughed at them. In the officers' clubs in Norfolk and the backrooms of the Pentagon, the idea was treated as a punchline. They called it Eleanor's Folly, a cruel nickname referencing the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, who had dared to suggest that a black man was capable of doing more in the United States Navy than shining shoes and peeling potatoes. The Admirals and the old salts shook their heads. They said that African Americans lacked the technical intelligence to operate sonar. They said they lacked the discipline to man a gun during a U-boat attack. They said that in the middle of a storm, when the ocean turned into a killing field, a crew of black sailors would panic, capsize, and sink. They didn't just expect the USS Mason to fail. They were betting on it. They viewed the ship not as a weapon of war, but as a social experiment destined for disaster. But they forgot one thing. They forgot that men who have survived the crushing pressure of American racism have a kind of buoyancy that cannot be taught in a naval academy. They forgot that when you have been told your whole life that you are nothing, the chance to be something is a fuel more powerful than diesel. The crew of the USS Mason didn't panic. They didn't sink. Instead, they took a small, fragile destroyer escort into the worst storm of the century and showed the entire United States Navy what true seamanship looked like. This is the untold story of the USS Mason, DE-529. It is the story of 160 black sailors who were handed a ship and told to hunt Nazis in the Atlantic. It is a story of Iron Men in tin cans. But before we leave the dock and head into the submarine-infested waters, I have a question for you. The ocean is a big, lonely place, but our history connects us across the waves. I want to know where you are standing. Watch from today. Whether you are near the coast in California, landlocked in Kansas, or watching from overseas in London or Sydney, drop your city in the comments below. Let's build a global crew for the voyage of the Mason. To understand why the USS Mason was so revolutionary and so hated, you have to understand the culture of the United States Navy in 1944. Of all the branches of the military, the Navy was the most aristocratic, the most traditional, and the most rigidly segregated. In the Army, a black man could at least hold a rifle, even if he was in a segregated unit. In the Navy, a black man was a servant. For generations, the only rating available to African Americans was mess attendant. They were the cooks. They were the waiters. They were the valets who laid out the captain's dress uniform and polished his shoes. They were forbidden from wearing the rates, badges, of the technical trades: gunner's mate, radio man, machinist. The Navy's official policy, written in black and white, stated that allowing black men to hold authority or operate complex machinery would destroy the morale of white sailors. They were viewed as furniture, essential for the comfort of the officers, but irrelevant to the fighting of the ship. Then came Pearl Harbor. Then came Dory Miller, the mess attendant who jumped behind a machine gun and shot down Japanese planes. The image of Miller shattered the myth that black men couldn't fight at sea. But the Navy brass was slow to change. They resisted. They dragged their feet. It took immense political pressure from the NAACP and the White House to force a crack in the door. That crack was the USS Mason. In late 1943, the Navy announced that it would commission a single ship with a predominantly black crew. It would be a Destroyer Escort, DE. Now, a Destroyer Escort is not a battleship. It is not an aircraft carrier. It is a small, cramped, unarmored vessel designed to protect slow merchant convoys from submarines. They were affectionately known as tin cans because their hull plating was so thin a heavy machine gun bullet could punch right through it. They were designed to be cheap, fast, and expendable. They rode the waves like a cork. In heavy seas, a DE would roll 40, 50, sometimes 60 degrees. Life on board was a constant physical assault of motion sickness, bruised shins, and wet clothes. The Navy decided to staff this ship with 160 African American sailors. But there was a catch. The officers, the captain, the executive officer, the department heads would all be white. The Navy wasn't ready to let a black man command a ship. The experiment was to see if black sailors could follow orders and operate the machinery, not if they could lead. The call went out for volunteers. The men who answered were not the dregs of the draft. They were the cream of black America. They were men who had joined the Navy, hoping for a chance to fight, only to be handed an apron. When they heard about the Mason, they realized this was their one shot. Take a man like James W. Graham. He was a young man from South Carolina. He had joined the Navy and was scrubbing pots in a galley. When he heard about the Mason, he transferred immediately. He wanted to be a radio man. He wanted to work with his mind. Or men like Lorenzo Dufault. He was a signalman. His job was to stand on the bridge and communicate with other ships using signal lights and flags. In any other unit, he would have been serving coffee. On the Mason, he was the voice of the ship. These men were sent to Norfolk, Virginia, for training, and from day one, they realized that they were fighting a war on two fronts. Norfolk was a Jim Crow city. It was segregated, hostile, and dangerous for a black man in uniform. But the hostility didn't stop at the shipyard gate. The white sailors on the base looked at the crew of the Mason with open disgust. They called the ship the Monkey Boat. They refused to salute the black petty officers. They vandalized their equipment. The training was rigorous. The crew had to learn everything from scratch. They had to learn how to operate the 3-inch guns, how to calibrate the depth charges, how to read the sonar screens that turned the invisible sounds of the ocean into a map of enemy submarines. The white instructors were skeptical. They expected the black sailors to be slow, to be clumsy. Instead, they found a hunger that scared them. The men of the Mason studied the manuals until the pages fell out. They drilled on the guns until their hands bled. They knew that they were living in a glass house. If a white sailor made a mistake, it was an accident. If a black sailor made a mistake, it was proof of inferiority. They had to be perfect. In March 1944, the USS Mason was commissioned. It was a cold, gray day. The crew stood at attention on the deck. They were wearing their dress blues. For the first time in history, you could look down the ranks of a U.S. warship and see nothing but black faces. There were no brooms in their hands. There were no trays. There were ratings badges on their sleeves. But as the ship prepared for its shakedown cruise, the test voyage to see if the ship and crew were seaworthy, the rumors began to swirl. The word in the fleet was that the Mason was a disaster waiting to happen. The betting pools in the officers' clubs were taking odds on when, not if, the ship would run aground or blow up its own boilers. The captain was Lieutenant Commander William Blackford. He was a white officer, a reservist. He came from a family of abolitionists, but he was also a man of his time. He was stern, fair, but cautious. He knew that his career was on the line too. If the Mason failed, he would be the man who failed to control the experiment. The shakedown cruise was brutal. They sailed to Bermuda. The Atlantic Ocean introduced itself with a storm. The little Destroyer Escort pitched and rolled. Seasickness swept through the crew. Men were vomiting at their stations, but they didn't leave their posts. They strapped themselves in. They kept the engines running. They fired the practice rounds. They returned to port with a rating of satisfactory. It wasn't excellent, but it wasn't failure. The Navy was surprised. They had expected chaos. They got competence. But a shakedown cruise is not war. Firing at a towed target is not the same as hunting a German U-boat that is trying to kill you. In the summer of 1944, the USS Mason received its orders. They were going to the North Atlantic. They were going to join the convoy escort groups. The North Atlantic in 1944 was the most dangerous stretch of water on Earth. The German wolf packs, groups of U-boats working together, were hunting the Allied supply ships. The water was freezing. Survival time, if you went overboard, was measured in minutes. The weather was unpredictable. The Mason was assigned to convoy NY-119. Their job was to shepherd a group of slow, heavy merchant ships and tugboats across the ocean to England. As the lines were cast off and the Mason pulled away from the pier, the black sailors looked back at the shore. They saw a country that wouldn't let them vote. They saw a navy that didn't want them. But as they looked forward, over the gray, choppy waves of the Atlantic, they saw something else. They saw a horizon that was open. Out there on the water, there were no white-only signs. There were no sheriffs. There was only the ship, the sea, and the enemy. They were about to enter the unforgiving crucible of convoy duty. They were about to face the wolf packs. And they were about to face a storm that would swallow white ships whole, leaving the unwanted crew of the Mason as the only thing standing between the convoy and destruction. The experiment was over. The war had begun. And the men of the USS Mason were ready to show the world that iron doesn't have a color. They laughed at them. In the officers' clubs in Norfolk and the back rooms of the Pentagon, the idea was treated as a punchline. They called it Eleanor's Folly, a cruel nickname referencing the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, who had dared to suggest that a black man was capable of doing more in the United States Navy than shining shoes and peeling potatoes. The Admirals and the old salts shook their heads. They said that African Americans lacked the technical intelligence to operate sonar. They said they lacked the discipline to man a gun during a U-boat attack. They said that in the middle of a storm, when the ocean turned into a killing field, a crew of black sailors would panic, capsize, and sink. They didn't just expect the USS Mason to fail, they were betting on it. They viewed the ship not as a weapon of war, but as a social experiment destined for disaster. But they forgot one thing. They forgot that men who have survived the crushing pressure of American racism have a kind of buoyancy that cannot be taught in a naval academy. They forgot that when you have been told your whole life that you are nothing, the chance to be something is a fuel more powerful than diesel. The crew of the USS Mason didn't panic. They didn't sink. Instead, they took a small, fragile destroyer escort into the worst storm of the century and showed the entire United States Navy what true seamanship looked like. This is the untold story of the USS Mason, DE 529. It is the story of 160 black sailors who were handed a ship and told to hunt Nazis in the Atlantic. It is a story of Iron Men in tin cans. But before we leave the dock and head into the submarine-infested waters, I have a question for you. The ocean is a big, lonely place, but our history connects us across the waves. I want to know where you are standing watch from today. Whether you are near the coast in California, landlocked in Kansas, or watching from overseas in London or Sydney, drop your city in the comments below. Let's build a global crew for the voyage of the Mason. To understand why the USS Mason was so revolutionary and so hated, you have to understand the culture of the United States Navy in 1944. Of all the branches of the military, the Navy was the most aristocratic, the most traditional, and the most rigidly segregated. In the Army, a black man could at least hold a rifle, even if he was in a segregated unit. In the Navy, a black man was a servant. For generations, the only rating available to African Americans was mess attendant. They were the cooks. They were the waiters. They were the valets who laid out the captain's dress uniform and polished his shoes. They were forbidden from wearing the rates, badges, of the technical trades. Gunner's mate, radio man, machinist. The Navy's official policy, written in black and white, stated that allowing black men to hold authority or operate complex machinery would destroy the morale of white sailors. They were viewed as furniture, essential for the comfort of the officers, but irrelevant to the fighting of the ship. Then came Pearl Harbor. Then came Dory Miller, the mess attendant who jumped behind a machine gun and shot down Japanese planes. The image of Miller shattered the myth that black men couldn't fight at sea. But the Navy brass was slow to change. They resisted. They dragged their feet. It took immense political pressure from the Intel-Torile ACP and the White House to force a crack in the door. That crack was the USS Mason. In late 1943, the Navy announced that it would commission a single ship with a predominantly black crew. It would be a Destroyer Escort, DE. Now, a Destroyer Escort is not a battleship. It is not an aircraft carrier. It is a small, cramped, unarmored vessel designed to protect slow merchant convoys from submarines. They were affectionately known as tin cans because their hull plating was so thin a heavy machine gun bullet could punch right through it. They were designed to be cheap, fast, and expendable. They rode the waves like a cork. In heavy seas, a DE would roll 40, 50, sometimes 60 degrees. Life on board was a constant physical assault of motion sickness, bruised shins, and wet clothes. The Navy decided to staff this ship with 160 African American sailors. But there was a catch. The officers, the captain, the executive officer, the department heads would all be white. The Navy wasn't ready to let a black man command a ship. The experiment was to see if black sailors could follow orders and operate the machinery, not if they could lead. The call went out for volunteers. The men who answered were not the dregs of the draft. They were the cream of black America. They were men who had joined the Navy hoping for a chance to fight, only to be handed an apron. When they heard about the Mason, they realized this was their one shot. Take a man like James W. Graham. He was a young man from South Carolina. He had joined the Navy and was scrubbing pots in a galley. When he heard about the Mason, he transferred immediately. He wanted to be a radio man. He wanted to work with his mind, or men like Lorenzo Dufour. He was a signalman. His job was to stand on the bridge and communicate with other ships using signal lights and flags. In any other unit, he would have been serving coffee. On the Mason, he was the voice of the ship. These men were sent to Norfolk, Virginia, for training, and from day one, they realized that they were fighting a war on two fronts. Norfolk was a Jim Crow city. It was segregated, hostile, and dangerous for a black man in uniform. But the hostility didn't stop at the shipyard gate. The white sailors on the base looked at the crew of the Mason with open disgust. They called the ship the Monkey Boat. They refused to salute the black petty officers. They vandalized their equipment. The training was rigorous. The crew had to learn everything from scratch. They had to learn how to operate the 3-inch guns, how to calibrate the depth charges, how to read the sonar screens that turned the invisible sounds of the ocean into a map of enemy submarines. The white instructors were skeptical. They expected the black sailors to be slow, to be clumsy. Instead, they found a hunger that scared them. The men of the Mason studied the manuals until the pages fell out. They drilled on the guns until their hands bled. They knew that they were living in a glass house. If a white sailor made a mistake, it was an accident. If a black sailor made a mistake, it was proof of inferiority. They had to be perfect. In March 1944, the USS Mason was commissioned. It was a cold, gray day. The crew stood at attention on the deck. They were wearing their dress blues. For the first time in history, you could look down the ranks of a U.S. warship and see nothing but black faces. There were no brooms in their hands. There were no trays. There were ratings badges on their sleeves. But as the ship prepared for its shakedown cruise, the test voyage to see if the ship and crew were seaworthy, the rumors began to swirl. The word in the fleet was that the Mason was a disaster waiting to happen. The betting pools in the officers' clubs were taking odds on when, not if, the ship would run aground or blow up its own boilers. The captain was Lieutenant Commander William Blackford. He was a white officer, a reservist. He came from a family of abolitionists, but he was also a man of his time. He was stern, fair, but cautious. He knew that his career was on the line too. If the Mason failed, he would be the man who failed to control the experiment. The shakedown cruise was brutal. They sailed to Bermuda. The Atlantic Ocean introduced itself with a storm. The little Destroyer Escort pitched and rolled. Seasickness swept through the crew. Men were vomiting at their stations, but they didn't leave their posts. They strapped themselves in. They kept the engines running. They fired the practice rounds. They returned to port with a rating of satisfactory. It wasn't excellent, but it wasn't failure. The Navy was surprised. They had expected chaos. They got competence. But a shakedown cruise is not war. Firing at a towed target is not the same as hunting a German U-boat that is trying to kill you. In the summer of 1944, the USS Mason received its orders. They were going to the North Atlantic. They were going to join the convoy escort groups. The North Atlantic in 1944 was the most dangerous stretch of water on Earth. The German wolf packs, groups of U-boats working together, were hunting the Allied supply ships. The water was freezing. Survival time, if you went overboard, was measured in minutes. The weather was unpredictable. The Mason was assigned to Convoy NY-119. Their job was to shepherd a group of slow, heavy merchant ships and tugboats across the ocean to England. As the lines were cast off and the Mason pulled away from the pier, the black sailors looked back at the shore. They saw a country that wouldn't let them vote. They saw a navy that didn't want them. But as they looked forward, over the gray, choppy waves of the Atlantic, they saw something else. They saw a horizon that was open. Out there, on the water, there were no white-only signs. There were no sheriffs. There was only the ship, the sea, and the enemy. They were about to enter the unforgiving crucible of convoy duty. They were about to face the wolf packs, and they were about to face a storm that would swallow white ships whole, leaving the unwanted crew of the Mason as the only thing standing between the convoy and destruction. The experiment was over. The war had begun, and the men of the USS Mason were ready to show the world that iron doesn't have a color. The barometer in the chart house dropped so fast it looked like the needle was broken. The sky, which had been a dull, slate gray, bruised into a violent shade of purple and black. The wind stopped singing in the rigging and started to scream, a high-pitched, demonic wail that drowned out the roar of the diesel engines. And then the Atlantic Ocean stood up. It didn't just rain. The ocean atomized. The wind whipped the tops off the waves, filling the air with a blinding, stinging horizontal sleet of salt water. The horizon vanished. The distinction between sea and sky was erased. There was only the gray void, and the mountain ranges of water rolling toward the USS Mason at 30 miles an hour. The waves were not waves. They were moving walls of hydraulic pressure, 60 feet high. When the Mason, a narrow, thin-skinned destroyer escort designed for speed, not stability, slid down the face of one of these monsters, the sensation wasn't sailing. It was falling. The bow would bury itself deep into the trough, plunging underwater. The propellers would lift out of the sea, spinning wild and free in the air, shaking the entire ship with a bone-rattling vibration that felt like the keel was snapping. Then, the buoyancy would kick in. The ship would shudder, groan like a dying animal, and heave itself upward, shedding tons of green water from the forecastle, only to face the next wall. Inside the ship, the world had been put into a blender. For the black sailors of the Mason, the experiment had moved from a test of skill to a test of pure survival. Seasickness was no longer an inconvenience. It was a plague. Men were vomiting until they were dry heaving bile, their stomachs cramping in agony. But they couldn't stop. You can't call in sick in a hurricane. The mess attendants tied themselves to the galley tables to keep from being thrown across the room. The radio men wedged themselves into their chairs with pillows and life jackets, trying to keep their headphones on while the ship rolled 40, 50, 60 degrees to the side. Every roll was a question. Is this the one? Is this the one where we don't come back? A destroyer escort is rated to recover from a certain degree of list. Beyond that point, physics takes over, and the ship capsizes. The Mason was pushing that limit every 30 seconds. Men walked on the bulkheads, walls, as often as they walked on the deck. Coffee pots, books, and loose tools became missiles. Down in the engine room, the Black Gang, the machinists and firemen, were working in the deepest circle of hell. The air was hot, thick with the smell of diesel and sweat. The noise was deafening, and they were blind. They couldn't see the waves. They could only feel the ship lurching violently beneath their feet. They watched the inclinometer, the gauge that measured the roll of the ship. It would swing past the red line. The lights would flicker. The steel hull plates would screech as the ocean tried to crush them. They knew that if the ship went down, they were trapped. They were below the waterline. There would be no escape. Yet, they stayed at their posts. They oiled the linkages. They adjusted the valves. They kept the heart of the ship beating because they knew that if the engines died, the Mason would turn broadside to the waves and roll over in seconds. Topside, the situation was catastrophic. The convoy, NY-119, was disintegrating. This wasn't a convoy of fast troop ships. It was a slow, clumsy collection of tugboats pulling barges, flat-bottomed ferries, and supply ships. They were barely seaworthy in calm water. In the storm of the century, they were helpless. The storm tore them apart. The massive tow lines, thick as a man's leg, snapped like cotton thread under the strain of the waves. Barges broke loose, drifting away into the howling darkness, carrying their terrified crews with them. The formation shattered. Ships were scattered over hundreds of miles of raging ocean. The radio traffic was a cacophony of panic. "Mayday! Mayday! Tow line snapped! We are taking on water! Engine failure! Where is the escort?" On the bridge of the Mason, Captain Blackford and his officers looked out at the chaos. Visibility was near zero. The rain was falling so hard it felt like hail. The radar screen was a mess of sea return, ghost signals created by the massive waves, hiding the real ships. They faced a decision that would define the soul of the ship. The standard procedure in a storm of this magnitude, when a convoy scatters, is for the escort ships to seek shelter or proceed to the destination and wait for the storm to pass. The tugs and barges were considered minor assets. They were expendable. The Destroyer Escort was a valuable warship. Logic dictated that the Mason should save itself. But the crew of the Mason wasn't operating on logic. They were operating on something deeper. The black signalmen on the bridge, the lookouts strapped to the railing to keep from being washed overboard, the helmsman fighting the wheel with muscles burning from lactic acid. They heard the distress calls. They knew that there were men on those barges. White men, yes, but sailors, Americans, men who were alone in the dark, drifting toward death. The racial divide that defined their lives in America evaporated in the face of the Atlantic. The ocean didn't care about Jim Crow. It wanted to kill everyone equally. And the men of the Mason decided they weren't going to let that happen. They didn't wait for the order to retreat. They waited for the order to hunt. When the command came to turn the ship around, to head back into the teeth of the storm to find the lost stragglers, a ripple of electric energy went through the crew. It was madness. Turning a ship in these waves was suicidal. If a wave caught them broadside during the turn, it would roll them over. The helmsman, A young black sailor from Chicago gripped the wheel. His knuckles were white. He watched the water. He timed the swell. He waited for a momentary lull between the mountains of water. "Hard to port!" He spun the wheel. The rudder bit into the water. The Mason leaned over, shuddering. A massive wave crashed over the side, submerging the entire port rail. The ship groaned. The lights dimmed. For a terrifying 10 seconds, the Mason hung, suspended between life and death, half underwater, fighting gravity. Then, she popped up. She shook off the water like a wet dog. She had made the turn. They headed back into the void. For the next 3 days, the USS Mason performed a miracle of seamanship. They didn't just ride out the storm. They attacked it. They crisscrossed the ocean, hunting for the lost barges. It was a mission of impossible precision. They had to pull alongside drifting, unpowered barges in 60-foot swells. The two steel hulls would rise and fall like elevators out of sync. If they collided, the thin skin of the Mason would be ripped open. The deck crews, the boatswain's mates, had to stand on the slippery, heaving deck, soaked to the bone, freezing in the gale, and throw heaving lines to the stranded ships. They had to pass tow cables by hand. One slip, and they would be washed overboard into a sea where rescue was impossible. There were moments of sheer terror. At one point, the structural stress on the ship became audible. The steel deck plates began to buckle and ripple, a phenomenon known as oil canning. The ship was flexing so much that the paint was popping off the metal. The damage control parties, black sailors with welding torches and shoring timbers, ran through the ship, bracing the bulkheads. They were literally holding the ship together from the inside, while the ocean tried to tear it apart from the outside. One night, the storm reached its peak. The wind was gusting to 90 miles per hour. The Mason took a roll that went past 65 degrees. Men were thrown from their bunks. In the galley, the crockery shattered. In the engine room, the oil pans sloshed, triggering low-pressure alarms. The ship hung there, on its side, for what felt like an eternity. The propellers thrashed the air. The men held their breath, waiting for the water to rush in. They prayed. They cursed. They thought of their mothers. And then, slowly, agonizingly, the keel did its work. The Mason righted herself. She was battered. Her radar mast was bent. Her railings were twisted. Her crew was exhausted, bruised, and terrified. But she was still floating, and she wasn't alone. Through the mist, they saw the shapes, the barges, the tugs. The Mason had found them. They had rounded up the scattered herd. They had guided them, towed them, and protected them through the worst the Atlantic could throw. When the storm finally broke, and the gray clouds gave way to a cold, pale sunlight, the convoy was battered, but largely intact. The white crews of the merchant ships looked out their portholes and saw the battered gray shape of the Destroyer Escort that had refused to abandon them. They saw the black sailors on the deck, chipping ice off the guns, waving tiredly. They realized that they were alive because of the Eleanor's Folly. They were alive because the men they had laughed at had possessed the skill to navigate a hurricane and the courage to turn back. The Mason limped into the harbor at Plymouth, England. The ship looked like a wreck. It was rusted, dented, and salt-stained. The crew looked like ghosts. Their eyes were sunken, their uniforms ruined. But as they tied up to the pier, there was a new feeling in the air. They weren't just sailors anymore. They were salt. They had survived the initiation. They had looked the ocean in the eye and made it blink. The British port authorities stared at the black crew with wide eyes. They had seen ships torn apart by less. They couldn't believe this tin can had made it. But the victory was short-lived. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of their condition set in. The ship was falling apart. The deck had cracked. The hull was compromised. The Mason needed urgent repairs in dry dock, and the crew needed rest. But rest was a luxury they wouldn't get, because while they had defeated the storm, they still hadn't defeated the skepticism of the Navy. The inspectors came aboard. They looked at the damage, and instead of seeing it as battle scars from a heroic rescue mission, some officers saw it as evidence of incompetence. They broke the ship, the whispers went. They didn't know how to handle her in rough seas. The men of the Mason were too tired to argue. They knew the truth. They knew they had saved the convoy. They had done the job that white crews on bigger ships had failed to do. But as they walked down the gangway onto English soil, leaving their broken ship behind for repairs, they didn't know that their greatest battle was still ahead. The storm had tested their seamanship. The next phase would test their resolve. They were about to enter the final months of the war, where they would be tasked with hunting the most dangerous prey in the ocean while fighting for the recognition that was already being stolen from them. The storm was over, but the silence was coming. The welding torches hissed in the damp English air, casting long, dancing shadows against the gray stone of the Plymouth dry dock. Sparks cascaded down the rusted hull of the USS Mason like a waterfall of fire. The ship looked less like a weapon of war and more like a car wreck that had been dragged from the bottom of a ravine. The storm had twisted her steel. It had popped her rivets. It had cracked her main deck plates as if a giant hand had tried to snap the ship in two. To the Navy inspectors walking around with clipboards, the damage was evidence. They muttered about poor handling and inexperienced crew. They looked at the black sailors chipping paint and saw only incompetence. But the crew of the Mason saw battle scars. They knew the truth. Those cracks weren't failures. They were receipts. They were the price paid for turning back into a hurricane to save the lives of white merchant mariners who would have otherwise drowned in the dark. Every dent in the hull was a badge of honor earned in 60-foot seas. As they scraped the barnacles and hammered the steel back into shape, the men of the Mason worked with a fierce, silent pride. They weren't just fixing a boat. They were healing a member of the family. By late 1944, the experiment had evolved. The 160 men who manned the Mason were no longer the nervous recruits who had stumbled off the train in Norfolk. They were salt. They walked with the wide-legged gait of men used to a shifting deck. Their uniforms were salt-stained and oil-streaked, worn with the casual disregard for regulation that marks a veteran unit. They knew the ship's personality, how she shuddered before a turn, how the ventilation hummed a specific note when the pressure dropped. They had merged with the machine. When the repairs were finished and the Mason slipped back into the cold embrace of the North Atlantic, the crew was ready. They were hungry. The war in Europe was entering its final bloody crescendo, and the German U-boat fleet, though battered, was not dead. In fact, it had become more dangerous. The Germans had introduced the Schnorkel, a snorkel device that allowed U-boats to run their diesel engines while submerged, making them faster, quieter, and harder to detect. They had acoustic torpedoes that homed in on the sound of a destroyer's propellers. The game had changed. It was no longer a brute force brawl. It was a high-tech chess match played in 3 dimensions. And the black sailors of the Mason proved they were grandmasters. The white officers on the bridge, led by Captain Blackford, had stopped micromanaging. They had learned to trust the voices coming through the voice tubes. When a black radio man reported a contact, they didn't double-check him. They acted. When a black gunner's mate called "gun ready," they knew the shell was in the breach. The racial hierarchy of the shore dissolved in the operational necessity of the sea. The convoy duty was a grind of freezing spray and sleepless nights. They patrolled the Black Pit, the gap in the mid-Atlantic where air cover couldn't reach. They ran interception patterns. They dropped Foxers, noisemakers towed behind the ship to distract the German acoustic torpedoes. It was dangerous, technical work. There were moments of heart-stopping violence. On one run, a U-boat was detected attempting to slip under the convoy screen. The sonar shack lit up. The ping was solid. The Mason surged forward, her bow cutting the water like a knife. "Stand by, Hedgehogs!" The Hedgehog was a forward-throwing mortar system. Unlike depth charges, which dropped off the back and exploded based on depth, Hedgehogs fired a circular pattern of bombs ahead of the ship. They only exploded on contact. If you heard a boom, you knew you had hit steel. The black sailors on the forecastle worked the mortar with the precision of a drill team. They loaded the spigot bombs. They aligned the launcher. They fired. The bombs arched through the air, splashing into the sea in a perfect ring. The ship held its breath. The sonar man listened. Silence. No explosion. The U-boat had evaded, slipping deep beneath a thermal layer that deflected the sonar beams. It was a miss, but the speed and coordination of the attack were flawless. The U-boat, terrified by the accuracy of the drop, broke contact and fled. The convoy was safe. There were no medals for a near miss. There were no headlines for convoy arrives safely. But the crew knew. They knew that somewhere in the deep, a Nazi crew was shaking in fear because of them. Yet, as the months dragged on, a bitter realization began to set in. The crew of the Mason was performing at the same level as any destroyer escort in the fleet. They were doing the same job, facing the same death, and saving the same ships. But the recognition wasn't there. When they pulled into ports in Belfast or Plymouth, they saw white crews from other ships bragging about commendations and ribbons. They saw the stars on the campaign medals. The Mason got nothing. They were the invisible shield. Captain Blackford saw it too. He was a fair man. He knew what his crew had done during the storm of the century. He knew they had saved the convoy when other ships had run for cover. He sat down in his cabin and wrote a formal recommendation. He recommended the entire crew for a letter of commendation from the Secretary of the Navy. It was the least they deserved. He typed it up. He signed it. He sent it up the chain of command. And then, silence. Weeks passed, then months. No reply. The recommendation didn't come back rejected. It just didn't come back. It vanished into the black hole of the Navy bureaucracy. To the men of the Mason, the message was clear. The Navy was happy to use them, but it wasn't willing to honor them. They were good enough to die, but not good enough to be decorated. This knowledge sat heavy in the mess deck. It fueled a quiet, simmering anger. But instead of breaking their spirit, it hardened it. They adopted a posture of defiant excellence. "We don't need their medals," they told themselves. "We know who we are." They bonded over the shared absurdity of their situation. They were fighting for democracy in an ocean where they were free, only to return to a land where they were not. They talked about home, about Harlem, about Chicago, about the farms in Georgia. They talked about the girls they left behind and the jobs they hoped to get. They supported each other through the Dear John letters and the news of lynchings back home. The ship became a sanctuary. It was a floating sovereign state of black excellence. The petty officers, men like motor machinists Mate Graham and Signalman Dufault, became the fathers and big brothers to the younger sailors. They enforced discipline, not with threats, but with the weight of expectation. "You represent us all," they would say. "Don't you dare drop that line." By May 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The U-boats were surfacing to surrender, flying black flags. When the news of VE Day reached the Mason in the middle of the Atlantic, there was celebration, yes, but it was muted. The white officers cheered. The black crew smiled, shook hands, and went back to work. They knew the war wasn't over. There was still the Pacific. There was still Japan. And there was still America. As the Mason received orders to return to the United States to be refitted for potential deployment to the Pacific Theater, a strange anxiety took hold of the crew. They had been gone for over a year. They had changed. They had seen the world. They had walked the streets of Belfast and Plymouth where white women had asked them to dance. They had been warriors. Now they were heading back to Norfolk, back to Virginia, back to the colored signs and the back of the bus. They wondered if the country had changed while they were gone. They wondered if their service had bought them any credit. They wondered if the double V, victory abroad, victory at home, was a real promise or just propaganda. As the coastline of the United States appeared on the horizon, a thin gray line separating the sea from the sky, the men of the USS Mason stood on the deck. They looked at the land they had defended. They looked at the flag snapping from the mast. They were proud. They were exhausted. But they were also afraid. Not of bullets or torpedoes, but of the reception that awaited them. They knew that the hardest part of their journey wasn't the storm they had survived at sea. It was the storm they were about to walk into on land. The anchor chain rattled down the hawsepipe. The engines went quiet. The Mason was home. But as the gangway was lowered and the shore patrol waited on the dock with their billy clubs and their cold stares, the men of the Mason realized that the experiment was over. Now, they were just black men again, and the Navy was about to show them exactly what that meant. The gangway of the USS Mason hit the pier in the Brooklyn Navy Yard with a heavy, final thud. It was the sound of a door closing. For the 160 men of the crew, walking down that incline was a journey across a psychological chasm. On the deck of the ship, they were the men of the Mason. They were the crew that had hunted U-boats in the Black Pit. They were the sailors who had turned back into a hurricane to save white lives. They walked with the roll of the ocean in their hips and the confidence of survivors in their eyes. But as their boots touched the concrete of the dock, they felt the weight descend. It was a physical sensation, heavy and suffocating, like a wool blanket soaked in water. It was the weight of America. There were no brass bands waiting for them. There were no cheering crowds of women waving handkerchiefs. There were no reporters with flashbulbs popping, eager to capture the heroes of the Atlantic. There was only a gray, industrial silence, broken by the bark of a white shore patrol officer pointing his baton toward a gate. "Move along. Keep it moving." They walked past the white sailors from other ships who were being greeted by families. They walked past the Red Cross stations, handing out coffee and donuts. They walked to the train station, their sea bags heavy on their shoulders, and they looked for the signs. They didn't have to look hard. Colored waiting room. It was a slap in the face. It was a cold bucket of water, waking them from the dream of equality they had tasted in the middle of the ocean. In the North Atlantic, a wave didn't ask your race before it tried to drown you. In New York, in 1945, your race was the only thing that mattered. The crew dispersed. They boarded trains, heading south to visit families in Georgia and Mississippi, or west to Chicago and Detroit. And on those trains, the heroes of Convoy NY-119 were forced to give up their seats. They were forced to sit in the smoking cars, choking on coal dust, while German prisoners of war, men who had sworn allegiance to Adolf Hitler, were escorted into the dining cars to eat hot meals on clean white tablecloths. Think about the rage required to sit there and not burn the train down. Think about the discipline it took to look at a Nazi soldier eating a steak while you, an American victor, gnawed on a cold biscuit in the dark. It was a test of character far harder than the storm. But the betrayal wasn't just social. It was professional. Captain William Blackford, the white commander who had watched his experiment succeed beyond his wildest dreams, had kept his word. He had filed the paperwork. He had recommended the entire crew for a letter of commendation from the Secretary of the Navy. It was a modest request. He wasn't asking for medals of honor. He was asking for a simple "well done" on official letterhead. He sent the file up the chain of command. It landed on a desk in Washington. A bureaucrat looked at it. He saw the ship's name. He saw the racial designation of the crew. And he buried it. There is no record of a rejection. There is no record of a debate. The recommendation simply vanished. It was lost in the circular file, the trash can of history. The Navy had gotten what it wanted out of the Mason. They had proven that they could use black manpower if they absolutely had to. But now that the war was ending, they had no interest in celebrating it. To honor the Mason was to admit that the segregation of the rest of the fleet was a lie. It was easier to pretend the ship had never existed. So, the crew received nothing. No ribbons. No letters. Just their discharge papers and a train ticket to oblivion. Then came the death of the ship itself. A sailor loves his ship. It is a living thing. It has a voice, a smell, a soul. The Mason was small, cramped, and rusted, but she was theirs. She was the only place in the world where they were kings. In 1947, the Navy decommissioned the USS Mason. They stripped her guns. They tore out her radios. They sold her to a scrapyard in New Jersey. The tin can that had survived the worst storm of the century was cut apart by acetylene torches. She was melted down. Her steel was recycled into cars, into girders, into toaster ovens. The physical evidence of the experiment was erased from the earth. There was no museum ship. There was no plaque, just scrap metal. And the men, they were scrapped too. They returned to civilian life in a country that was booming, but not for them. They had skills. James Graham was a brilliant radio man. Lorenzo Dufault was an expert signalman. The machinists could fix high-pressure steam turbines in the dark. They went to the employment offices. They applied for jobs at the phone company, at the electric utility, at the shipping lines. They showed their discharge papers. "I was a petty officer on a destroyer," they said. The hiring managers looked at them. They saw black faces. They didn't see technicians. They saw janitors. "We don't hire your kind for those jobs," they were told, "but we have an opening in the mailroom. Or you can sweep the loading dock." It was a waste of human potential on a criminal scale. Men who could navigate by the stars were forced to shine shoes. Men who could calculate torpedo trajectories were forced to dig ditches. The GI Bill, which built the white middle class, was systematically denied to them through redlining and discriminatory college admissions. So they took the jobs they could get. They went quiet. This is the Great Silence. For decades, the men of the Mason stopped talking about the war. Why bring it up? No one believed them anyway. When they tried to tell people in the barbershops that they had hunted subs in the Atlantic, people laughed. Black men on a destroyer? Stop lying, man. You were a cook. The culture reinforced the lie. Hollywood churned out war movies by the dozen. The Enemy Below. Run Silent, Run Deep. They showed heroic white captains and heroic white crews. The black sailor was totally absent from the screen. The veterans of the Mason sat in movie theaters and watched their own lives being played by white actors. They watched their history being stolen, frame by frame. It was a form of gaslighting that made them question their own memories. Did we really do that? Or did I dream it? They aged. Their hair turned gray. Their backs bent under the weight of labor and indignity. They raised children and grandchildren who knew little of their service. The uniform went into the back of the closet, smelling of mothballs and lost glory. The psychological toll was immense. To know you are a hero and to be treated like a zero creates a fracture in the soul. Some drank, some became bitter, but most just endured. They carried the secret of the Mason like a hidden diamond in their pocket, something precious that the world was too stupid to value. But the bond of the sea is stronger than the silence of the land. Even as they scattered across the country, a few kept in touch. They wrote letters. "Hey, shipmate, remember the storm? Remember the U-boat?" They held onto the proof of their existence in the form of fading black and white photographs and the rust-stained pages of the Blue Jackets' manual. They were waiting. They didn't know what they were waiting for, but they knew that the story wasn't over. They knew that the truth has a buoyancy of its own. You can sink it. You can bury it under paperwork. You can weigh it down with lies. But eventually, it will break the surface. And in the 1990s, almost 50 years after they walked down that gangway in Brooklyn, the surface began to ripple. It started with a book. Not a history book written by a scholar, but a curiosity. People began to ask questions about the Black Crew, and a few of the survivors, now old men in their 70s, decided it was time to speak. They weren't asking for money. They weren't asking for pity. They were asking for the one thing the Navy had denied them for half a century. They were asking for their names back. They wanted the world to know that the USS Mason wasn't a joke. It wasn't Eleanor's Folly. It was a war ship, and they were the Iron Men who sailed her. But they were racing against the clock. The crew was dying. Every year, there were fewer Christmas cards exchanged. Every year, another voice fell silent. If the recognition didn't come soon, there would be no one left to receive it. The archives were dusty. The files were lost. The ship was gone. But the memory was about to go to war with the bureaucracy. The ghosts were tired. By the early 1990s, the Iron Men of the USS Mason were in their 70s. The hands that had wrestled the helm in a hurricane now shook with tremors. The eyes that had scanned the horizon for periscopes were clouded with cataracts. They were grandfathers living in quiet retirement in the suburbs of Chicago, the row houses of Philadelphia, and the neighborhoods of New York. They were the deacons of their churches and the patriarchs of their families. To the world, they were just old black men moving slowly through the twilight of their lives. But inside, the fire was still burning. The ember of injustice, planted in 1945 when they walked down that silent gangway, had never been extinguished. It smoldered. Every time they saw a documentary about the Battle of the Atlantic that showed only white faces, the ember flared. Every time they walked past a VFW hall where they had once been unwelcome, it burned. They knew what they had done, and they knew the clock was ticking. Death was no longer a U-boat stalking them from the depths. It was time itself. The crew roster was shrinking. Every Christmas, fewer cards arrived. They realized with a cold, sinking dread that if they didn't speak up now, the story of the USS Mason would die with them. It would be buried in the ground, just another forgotten chapter of Black history. Then a catalyst arrived. Her name was Mary Pat Kelly. She wasn't a sailor. She wasn't a historian. She was a writer and a filmmaker who stumbled upon the story of the Mason almost by accident. But when she met the survivors, men like James Graham and Lorenzo Defoe, she didn't see subjects. She saw giants. She saw men carrying a burden of history that was too heavy for them to bear alone. She became their megaphone. She became the bridge between the memory of the crew and the bureaucracy of the Pentagon. Kelly began to dig. She went where the Army inspectors hadn't bothered to go in 1945. She went into the National Archives. She pulled the dusty, declassified logs of Convoy NY-119. And there, buried under 50 years of paperwork, she found the smoking gun. She found the letters from Captain William Blackford. The crew had always wondered, did the old man really fight for us? Or was he just talking? The archives held the answer. Blackford hadn't just recommended them for a commendation. He had fought for it. He had written detailed reports praising their seamanship, their discipline, and their courage during the storm. He had told the admirals that these men were the equal of any white crew in the fleet, and she found the proof of the betrayal. She found the stamps and the signatures that routed the recommendation into the trash. It wasn't a mistake. It was a pocket veto. The Navy of 1945 simply refused to process a commendation for a black crew. When Kelly showed these documents to the survivors, the reaction was overwhelming. Grown men wept. It was a vindication. They weren't crazy. They weren't remembering it wrong. They were heroes, and their captain had loved them. Armed with this proof, the Mason boys decided to suit up one last time. They organized a reunion. It wasn't in a mess hall. It was in a hotel ballroom. But the energy was the same. Men who hadn't seen each other since they were 20 years old embraced. They looked at the wrinkled faces and saw the young sailors underneath. They slapped backs and told the old jokes. Remember the vomit in the galley? Remember the U-boat? But the most powerful moment came when they put on their uniforms. Most of the men couldn't fit into their original 1944 jumper blues. They wore blazer patches or VFW caps. But a few, the slender ones, slid back into the wool uniforms they had kept in the back of their closets for half a century. They buttoned the buttons. They adjusted the neckerchiefs. When they looked in the mirror, the years melted away. They stood straighter. The blue jacket swagger returned. They weren't retirees anymore. They were the crew of DE 529. But nostalgia wasn't the goal. Recognition was. Mary Pat Kelly and the veterans took their fight to the Pentagon. They requested a meeting with the Secretary of the Navy. They didn't go begging. They went demanding payment on a debt. The meeting was tense. The Pentagon is a machine designed to look forward, not backward. The admirals were wary of reopening old wounds. They were afraid of setting precedents. The records are incomplete, they said. It was a long time ago, they said. We can't change history. But the veterans of the Mason had a response. We made history. You just erased it. They told their stories. James Graham spoke of the radios. Lorenzo Dufault spoke of the storm. They described the terror of the waves and the pride of the rescue. They spoke with a clarity and a dignity that shamed the bureaucrats sitting across the table. They weren't asking for money. They were asking for the letter of commendation that Captain Blackford had written 50 years ago. The pressure began to mount. The story hit the press, the New York Times, the Washington Post, television networks. They all picked up the story of the forgotten crew. The image of these elderly black men, standing tall in their old uniforms, demanding justice, was irresistible. It tapped into a national desire for redemption. America wanted to believe it could fix the mistakes of the past, but the clock was ruthless. During the months of negotiation, the phone would ring. Another crew member had passed away. Another heart had stopped beating before the medal could be pinned on the chest. It was a race against the Reaper. Every delay by the Navy felt like a personal insult. Every "we're reviewing the file" was a gamble with a man's life. The survivors felt the urgency in their bones. They wanted to hold that piece of paper before they died. They wanted to show it to their grandchildren and say, "See, it was real." Finally, in 1994, the wall crumbled. Secretary of the Navy John Dalton, a man who understood the weight of the moment, looked at the evidence. He looked at the recommendations. He looked at the men. And he decided to do the right thing. He didn't just approve the letter of commendation. He upgraded it. He declared that the crew of the USS Mason had performed meritorious service and deserved the recognition that had been stolen from them. But the Navy went one step further. They realized that a piece of paper, 50 years late, wasn't enough. They needed a gesture that would stand the test of time. They needed something made of steel. They invited the survivors to Washington, D.C. for an official ceremony. It was a cold winter day. The wind whipped through the Capitol, reminding the men of the North Atlantic. They gathered in the Navy Memorial. There were fewer of them now. A dozen or so men, leaning on canes, supported by their wives and children. When Secretary Dalton stood up to speak, the room went silent. He looked at the old men in the front row. "For too long," Dalton said, "your country has ignored you. For too long, your service has been in the shadows. Today, we bring you into the light." He presented the awards. The letter of commendation was finally delivered. It was framed. It was official. It was signed by the Secretary of the Navy. James Graham held the frame in his hands. His fingers traced the seal of the Department of the Navy. He wept. Not tears of sadness, but tears of release. The weight he had carried since 1945, the weight of being unwanted, lifted off his shoulders. He looked at his wife. "We did it," he whispered. "We really did it." Lorenzo Dufault stood at the podium. He looked out at the sea of uniforms, modern admirals, black and white, saluting him. He thought about the white sailors in Norfolk who had called his ship the Monkey Boat. He thought about the train conductor who had forced him into the smoking car. "We served," Dufault said, his voice strong. "We did our job, and we never quit." It was a victory, a glorious, belated victory. But as they left the ceremony, clutching their awards, there was a bittersweet feeling. They thought of the empty chairs. They thought of the men who had died of alcoholism and despair in the 1960s, believing they were failures. They thought of the fathers who had never been able to prove to their sons that they were heroes. Justice delayed is justice denied, the saying goes. And for many of the Mason crew, it was true. The recognition couldn't fix the broken lives. It couldn't give them back the careers they were denied. But it did something else. It rewrote the ending of the story. They were no longer the men who were erased. They were the men who returned. They had forced the United States Navy to apologize. They had forced the history books to add a new chapter, and the Navy wasn't done with them yet. As the veterans boarded their planes to go home, thinking the fight was over, a rumor began to circulate. The Navy was building a new class of destroyers, the Arleigh Burke class, the most advanced warships on the planet, guided missiles, Aegis radar, the ultimate predators, and the Navy was looking for names. Usually, destroyers are named after admirals, war heroes, presidents. But someone in the Pentagon, maybe Secretary Dalton, maybe an historian who had been touched by the story, had an idea. What if they named a destroyer not after a man, but after a crew? What if they named it after the tin can that refused to sink? What if the USS Mason sailed again? It was a radical proposal. It would be the ultimate vindication. A billion-dollar warship carrying the legacy of the experiment. The survivors went home to wait. They were old. They were tired. But they had one more watch to stand. They had to stay alive long enough to see if the Navy would keep its final promise. The ocean was calling them back. Not the cold gray Atlantic of 1944, but the future. A future where a black captain could stand on the bridge of a ship named Mason, and no one would laugh. The Bath Iron Works in Maine is a cathedral of war. It is a place of fire, steel, and sparks, where the United States Navy builds its monsters. On a gray morning in June 2001, the shipyard was humming with a different kind of energy. A crowd had gathered. Admirals in dress whites, politicians in suits, and thousands of sailors stood in the shadow of a Leviathan. Towering above them was the hull of a new Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer. It was 509 feet of high-tech violence. It was armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles capable of hitting a target 1,000 miles away. It possessed the Aegis combat system, a radar spiderweb that could track 100 targets at once. It was a billion-dollar predator, the apex of naval engineering. Painted on the stern, in letters that could be seen from the sky, was the name USS Mason. And sitting in the front row, looking up at this mountain of gray steel, were the men of 1944. There were only a handful of them left. James Graham, Lorenzo Dufault, maybe 10 others. They were in their 80s now. Their hair was white like the sea foam. Their backs were bent. They leaned on canes and walkers, their bodies worn down by time and the hard labor of a country that had undervalued them for half a century. But as they looked at the ship, their eyes were young. The contrast was enough to stop your heart. In 1944, they had sailed on a tin can, a disposable, unarmored escort that rusted in the salt and rolled until men vomited blood. It was a ship built to be sacrificed. Now, they were looking at a ship built to rule the ocean. The Navy had taken the name of a segregated, unwanted experiment and welded it onto the most powerful warship on the planet. The tin can was gone. The legacy had become titanium. When the ceremony began, the speeches were not the hollow platitudes of 1945. They were apologies wrapped in reverence. The Secretary of the Navy spoke. The Chief of Naval Operations spoke. They didn't talk about colored troops. They talked about the men of the Mason. They recounted the storm. They recounted the U-boats. They recounted the courage of men who answered the call when the phone was ringing in a segregated hallway. Lorenzo Dufault, the signalman who had once stood on a freezing bridge blinking messages into the dark, was helped to the podium. He touched the microphone. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the ship. "This is not just a ship," he said, his voice trembling with the magnitude of the moment. "This is a promise kept." Then came the christening. The bottle of champagne swung. It shattered against the steel bow. The foam ran down the hull like white blood. The band played "Anchors Aweigh," and the old men wept. They wept for the friends who had died in the Atlantic. They wept for the men who had died of despair in the 1960s, believing they were failures. They wept for the fathers who never got to see this day. It was a release of 50 years of held breath. But the true vindication happened when they went aboard. The Navy had flown them up not just to watch, but to inspect. They were lifted onto the deck. They walked, slowly, painfully, through the passageways. They touched the bulkheads. They smelled the fresh paint and the ozone of the electronics. They were taken to the bridge. In 1944, the bridge of the USS Mason was a white space. Black sailors were allowed there to deliver coffee or send signals, but never to command. It was the Forbidden City. On the new USS Mason, DDG-87, the bridge was a spaceship of screens and joysticks. But it wasn't the technology that shocked the veterans. It was the faces. They saw black officers. They saw women officers. They saw a crew that looked like America. And standing there, wearing the gold stripes of command, was the captain. Imagine the feeling of James Graham, the radio man who had been told he wasn't smart enough to be an officer. He looks at the captain's chair, and he sees a black man sitting in it. Or he sees a black woman running the Combat Information Center. The loop was closed. The experiment had become the establishment. The men of 1944 had suffered the indignity of segregation so that the men and women of 2001 could stand on the bridge with their heads held high. They realized, in a flash of clarity, that they hadn't just escorted convoys across the Atlantic. They had escorted the United States Navy into the future. The new ship carried more than just their name. It carried their spirit. The motto of DDG-87, emblazoned on the crest, is "Proudly we served." It is a direct quote from the survivors. It is the answer to every insult, every blue discharge, every N-word thrown at them by an MP. Inside the ship, in the mess deck, there is a shrine. It is a museum case. Inside are the photos of the original crew, the grainy black and white snapshots of smiling young men in dungarees. There are copies of the Lost Commendation. There is a piece of the original hull. Every sailor who serves on the modern Mason, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, has to walk past that shrine, They have to look at the faces of the men who paved the way. They are taught the history. They know that they are not just serving on a destroyer. They are serving on a monument to resilience. When the USS Mason deploys today, hunting pirates off Somalia or tracking submarines in the Pacific, it carries a unique energy. It is a ship with a soul. The crew calls themselves the Mason family. They know that they are guarding a legacy that is fragile and precious. For the last surviving veterans, that day in Maine was the finish line. They had done it. They had corrected the record. They could finally rest. James Graham passed away. Lorenzo Defoe passed away. One by one, the Iron Men slipped their cables and drifted out to the eternal sea. But they didn't die with heavy hearts. They died knowing that they had won. They died knowing that 100 years from now, a gray ship will still be cutting through the waves, carrying their name, and telling the world that they were here. This story forces us to redefine the concept of victory. Victory isn't just about winning the war. It's about winning the peace. It's about winning the memory. The men of the USS Mason were given a tin can and told to sink. They refused. They were given a segregated country and told to accept it. They refused. They were given oblivion and told to vanish. They refused. They are the ultimate example of the American spirit, not the sanitized version, but the rugged, dirty, beautiful reality of it. They proved that patriotism is not a passive act. It is a fight. It is a fight against the enemy abroad and a fight against the demons at home. As we stand at the end of this journey, the ocean is calm. The storm of 1944 has passed. The U-boats are rust on the bottom of the Atlantic. But the lesson of the Mason is still active. It teaches us that we do not have to accept the world as it is. We can change it. We can steer the ship into the storm, even when everyone else is turning back. We can hold the line. The USS Mason is more than a ship. It is a beacon. It signals to every marginalized person, every underdog, every person who has been told they are unwanted, that they have value, that they can be the captains of their own destiny. So, here are your final orders.